Good morning, everyone. Good evening to some of our guests who are visiting us from Poland and elsewhere across the ocean. We at one point were hoping to be able to bring all of the participants to Chicago to be here. And I have to say, the weather today and yesterday has been just miserable. It's been raining the whole time. And this morning they are inaugurating the new president at the University of Chicago, so streets are blocked off. So there would have been all kinds of confusion about access. And so maybe it's good that we are all nestled in our warm, cozy Zoom abodes. And it always is, of course, a great advantage that we can make the event international and allow people to attend from everywhere, whether they're speaking or not. So I want to begin by welcoming you all, thanking you for joining us. And then I want to thank Esther Peters and Matthew Weflin at the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies for handling all of the technical aspects of preparing and hosting the conference and many other things with their usual aplomb. I also want to acknowledge the important role played by Yeva Dilit and Grażyna Miknevičiūtė from the Lithuanian consulate, who first approached us with the idea of an event celebrating the 110th anniversary of the birth of Czesław Miłosz. It was their relation to Miłosz's birthplace and mine perhaps to the place where he spent most of the last years of his life that made us think about a conference devoted to his sense of place. But when I began thinking about this question and studying up on it, I quickly realized that to study the poetics of place in Miłosz, one has to read all of the poetry and all of the essays and memoirs, and alongside these, all of the biographies. It's just everywhere. So we could celebrate other anniversaries today, maybe the 90th of Miłosz writing about place, or maybe that's even not a big enough number. The 70th of scholars from around the world paying attention to it. Karl Jaspers and Stephen Spender, among others, reviewed The Captive Mind in 1953. In the years since then, many scholars have devoted great energy to understanding Miłosz far better than I, who've only recently joined their ranks. And thankfully, we'll be hearing more from them today than from me. So I'm really going to keep these comments to the minimum. And we'll just start things off really with a short quotation from Miłosz, and then we will begin. So he writes, "Imagination, always spatial, points north, south, east, and west of some central privileged space, probably a village from one's childhood." So today we'll be considering those movements of the poet's imagination, alongside real migrations and displacements that continue to shape his writing as he sought his place within a series of landscapes, physical and cultural. So we will begin with a paper from from Karina Jarzyńska, who works at the Faculty of Polish Studies at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, as a researcher of 20th century Polish literature. She's a member of the Center for Research on Memory Cultures in Krakow, which is affiliated with the Memory Studies Association, and a collaborator at the Czesław Miłosz Center. She has authored 2 books, Literature as a Spiritual Exercise, Czesław Miłosz's work in Post-Secular Perspective in 2018, and Epics of the World at the Sources of Culture in 2011. She recently co-edited a volume entitled Sites of Memory, Necrotopologies, which is one of the results of a research project on genocide sites that are unmemorialized, that has been funded by the Polish Ministry of Science and Higher Education. Her paper this morning is titled Creating One's Own Second Space Within the Literary World System. Czesław Miłosz in dialogue with Oskar Miłosz. Thank you, Karina.
Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. Maybe some other times of day are happening somewhere there. With you, I'm just sharing my screen now. Do you see it? Do you see my presentation? Please let me know.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you, Bill, especially for the invitation to this meeting. It's my honor to be able to discuss this topic in such excellent company. The ongoing pandemics has made our own location problematic. And while preparing this opening slide, I was wondering where exactly are we now in Chicago, above those cities. I just thought that just would be laughing at the kind of irony of the situation as we speak. My presentation stems from my long-standing fascination with Miłosz's poem From the Rising of the Sun, in which a somewhat analogous situation occurs. The poet juxtaposes Eastern European and American spaces, using language to create a third distinct spatial quality. I would just show you the slide where I kind of give the glimpse of how the poem is structured. I assume that many of you are familiar with the text, so I won't read the quotations on the upcoming slides. Yet I just wanted to everyone to know how it is structured, that it has 7 parts, and it takes about 50 pages of the new and collected poems by Miłosz. So it's a really long, like quasi-epic poem, as I think of it. So this space created by this poem can be described in many ways, and many have already tried to do it, including some of people present here on this conference. I myself made my first attempt at this topic and published an article on that. Yet my recent research in canon studies has led me to return to this topic with the hope of shedding new light on what happens in this poem and I think in many other Miłosz's works. As the title of my speech implies, I will argue that the space created by Czesław Miłosz in this poem is not only a form of literary intercontinental home he created for himself after moving from France to the United States, it is also a metaphysical space, a second space, to use a title of his last book of poetry published in 2002, which gives his experience a religious gravity. Yet it is also a political space, as I would argue, and in a double sense. Firstly, it is entangled in the policies of a peripheral cultural community, of which Miłosz claims to be a representative, seeking to nobilitate this culture of his origin, just like his romantic precursor, the poet and emigre Adam Mickiewicz used to nobilitate his culture of origin. Yet secondly, this is a political space, I think, where struggle for power takes place, meaning the power in the literary field. A struggle for one's own Polish-Lithuanian voice against the domination of global languages. A struggle for an original poetic diction against the authors of other modernist long poems, such as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, translated by Miłosz. A partner in this agon, to use Harold Bloom's term, is Oskar Władysław Delubicz Miłosz, as a Lithuanian French poet, as a mystic, and last but not least, an elder relative of Czesław. The voluminous 7-part poem From the Rising of the Sun was written in California between the essayistic books Vision of San Francisco Bay and The Land of Ulro. In my already published article, I focus on the references to the Christian liturgy, the liturgy of the hours present in this work. And I was seeking to identify the ways in which religious tradition can become an ally in the process of acculturation. Such an analysis allows us to interpret this poem as a form of reconciliation of Miłosz's American and Lithuanian experiences through textual practices inspired by Catholic rituals. This interpretative strategy has been inspired by the post-secular turn in literary studies, which encourages to examine narratives about new modern modes of religiously defined perception and being. And here I refer to the book Partial Faiths by John McClure. On the other hand, post-secular turn in literary studies encourages us to perceive literature as similar to theology, as a space where, as John Caputo puts it, we dream of what is to come, in which we pray and beg for something that our eyes have not yet seen, nor our ears heard, in which we dare to step into the territory of what does not exist. So this is this post-secular approach that I come from here, but please let me throw some other theoretical tools on the table. And firstly, I will just show you the very beginning of the poem, From the Rising of the Sun, part 1, The Unveiling. What you can see here is the sign of how important space is in this poem. It's right in the beginning, we read about this kind of disorientation that is characteristic for the poetical subject of this work. The first stanza creates a situation of chronotopical confusion, to refer to Mihail Bakhtin. The narrator situates himself in the void, outside of the definite here and now, so that in the following verses, some spatial circumstances could be defined. Only then his identity also is determined. So this whatever, wherever that we find at the beginning of first 2 verses marks this disorientation, and then some specific space is created, but only then. This literary strategy corresponds with Dominique Mongenot's concept of literature as self-constituting discourse. That's why one of my important inspirations. In addition to literature, the French scholar defines in this way religion, law, philosophy, and science, which are discourses that independently determine the conditions of truthfulness of their own claims. They manage their own context, as he puts it. Mongenot identifies several ways in which a text can achieve this status. One is to abstract, to distance itself from the conditions under which it was produced, and situate its narrator somewhere else. Mongenot describes the position of this narrator as paratopic. It is not here on the slide, I'm afraid, but it's an important notion for Mongenot, paratopic position, that is being partially outside the community to which the message is addressed. Another method of this textual self-constitution is to refer to the community's established arche, that is this put here in the third place, That is, on the one hand, the moral or aesthetic ideals important to it, and on the other hand, it can be a reference to an archive of texts important to the community's identity, kind of a canon. Such procedures give the texts strong legitimacy and performative power, allowing them not only to join the canon, but also to modify the measure according to which it would be created in the future. So this paratopic position, the reference to arche, the archive, or this is this wordplay of the word archeon that Mongeno proposes. Something between or both referring to arche and archive. And also this absolute ideals such as truth, beauty, and goodness are also very like fortunate in this performative context, in like context of this theory. Okay, I think Miłosz pursues this kind of goal in his poem, wanting not only to overcome the sense of loss that accompanies him as an emigrant, but also to carry out the mission to which he feels summoned in the provinces, as we can read in this first stanza. The initial disorientation of the lyrical subject is a device that ultimately gives him special prerogatives by power of his paratopic position outside the ordinary time and space. The wherever is not only quickly replaced by the image of a specific space, it is also replaced by a certain sacred space. And in red, you can see underlined some signs of the sacredness. The dark blue cloud, the red horse, and the sealed rose. Those are the elements of the Christian eschatological imaginary. This is also the first of many signals of the poem's mythological dimension, alluding not only to Catholic orthodoxy, close to Miłosz because of his upbringing, but also to the catastrophic trend in pre-war Polish literature. That is this phrase koń rydzy, here in Polish, translated by Robert Hass and Czesław Miłosz as Red Horse. That is the title of a short story by Czechowicz, friend of Miłosz, and also like catastrophic eschatological writer of pure Polish literary scene. The poem also alludes to the mystical interpretations of the apocalypse by Western esoteric thinkers who would later become the protagonists of the Land of Ulro, such as Emanuel Swedenborg, William Blake, and last but not least, Oskar Miłosz. And to concentrate, to focus on Oskar Miłosz, let me switch to the beginning of third part of the poem, Lauda, where you can find the most direct reference to the Oskar Miłosz that appears in the poem. Not the only reference, but the most evident. The alchemist, this eminent alchemist that is mentioned here, can be identified as Oskar Miłosz, thanks to the introduction to his works written by Czesław. And I will go back to this slide later on. Now, please let me switch to another one. And here you have covers of two anthologies of Oskar Miłosz's writings. Czesław Miłosz was an important collaborator. The Noble Traveler and Storge. This is the Polish version of this anthology, translated only by Czesław Miłosz, and here he is one of the translators. So in the introduction to those books, Czesław Miłosz refers to the treatise of Oskar entitled Ars Magna, and he refers to it as an alchemical work. Ars Magna meaning alchemy. He also refers to the fact that Oskar Miłosz called himself a son of Descartes. So this is this, yes, the ally of the card, as we find in Lauda. And also he refers to the special importance Oskar Miłosz gave to the human need to situate all things. The strongest argument, however, to identify Oskar as this eminent alchemist is the quotation from the Epistle to Storge, in which Oskar lists almost the same lands we read about in Lauda as manifestation of this need to situate all things. And you have here the list of them. And it's just, well, somewhat identical than the list we find here, right? Sana, Armageddon, Patmos, Lete, Arcadia, and or Parnassus. Czesław uses Oskar's authority to add Lauda, the peripheral region of his origin, to the array of the creations of the human imagination that have already gained recognition from a global audience. The power of this authority stems not only from the fact that the elderly relative functioned in Paris, the cultural capital of the world of his time. Also, he wrote in French and gained a certain amount of fame. Yet Oskar Miłosz's authority stems also of him being a mystic, as in 1914 he had a vision of the Jehovah's angel, which meant, to quote Czesław, that he was ordained as a preacher of a new Christian cosmology, heralding a reconciliation of religion, science, and art. This is the quotation of this introduction to Storge. The sacred ordain, along with the reference to the card as symbol of rationality and to Albert Einstein, the saint of the modern physics, legitimize Czesław's poetic cosmology. I would like to draw your attention to an element of this textual performance that allows us to perceive one of the stakes of this poetic interplay that Czesław Miłosz proposes to his readers. The word Parnassus that I highlighted in red. It suggests that this poem is not only about a recognition that Lauda is a legitimate and important orientation point for the human imagination. It's as important as Greek, Roman, Christian, and esoteric afterworlds. The poem is also about recognition that the author, writing in a language as peripheral as Lithuanian or Polish, deserves to take place on the literary Parnassus, the land of the chosen poets. Classical Latin imagery proves to be a particularly important point of reference for Miłosz, as evidenced by the intriguing note we encounter a few stanzas later. And here you can see it on slide. He explains what the Lauda means. And we can see here this strange quotation. This Lauda is the Lithuanian Liauda and is not related to the Latin laudare. It's a rhetorical figure of apophrasis or praeteritio, as Miłosz brings up Latin by denying that it should be brought up. He establishes importance of Lithuanian context in relation to classical antiquity, and also with the help of Lithuanian encyclopedia, an important archive for the peripheral community. The final passage I wanted to share with you from The Rising of the Sun is the also mere beginning of the part 6, the accuser, which supports this interpretative framework. Numerous references to the Latin literary tradition are present here, in which the lyrical subject explicitly admits that they were an important point of reference for him and guided his desire for literary fame and even immortality. At the same time, he expresses his disappointment that, far from his homeland, poetic laurel is virtually inaccessible to him. And in the Encyclopedia of the English Language, the modern functional equivalent of Latin, he will at best occupy a place between Sam Miller and Mickey Mouse. One can read from this passage the author's self-accusation of the sin of pride, which is justified in the context of the poem as a whole. But I propose to draw attention to its particular performative power, which I believe has contributed to our meeting today. I'm worried a little bit that I just finished my time. Can I just take a little longer? One last page. Okay. If not, just let me know. The author who helped me understand this mechanism is Marko Juvan. That is the last theoretical context that I would like to share with you. Marko Juvan wrote inspiring book Worldlink, a peripheral literature, which in turn draws on the thinking of such scholars as Alexander Beecroft, the author of The Ecology of World Literature. Juvan describes the process of Slovenian authors coming from the shadow of the Greco-Latin auctores to become perceived as representatives of their particular community. As vernacular languages entered the realm of cultivated communication, their social linguistic prestige increased, and they began to compete with the cosmopolitan domain of Latin. Simultaneously, vernacular corpus of literary text gradually were expanding and overcoming the paternalism of the classical canon. Juvan also notes that the Parnassus symbolized the origins of canonicity and the act of being chosen to speak the divine language of poetry. So intertextual references to the stopoi, the Parnassus, are cases of systemic self-referentiality and meta-poetry, as he puts it. According to Juvan, I quote, the intertextual appropriations of Parnassus and Elysium in Slovenian meta-poetry marked the transition from a multi-purpose, multilingual older literature to a modern monolingual Slovenian literature. As a consequence, this peripheral literature gained a canonical status in two senses, as an element of world literature and as so-called national classic. The second type of canon, which was formed individually in each national literature. Actually, he describes this kind of interplay between the national canon and the world canon that could be grabbed by close reading of such interplays as this Parnassus figure. And I think that this is exactly what happens in Miłosz's poetry, yet not exactly, as Juvan is interested in the Romanticism, and now we are in a, of course, more complicated and different stage of world literature's history. Let me now come to my conclusion. The need to locate oneself, which motivated the poem From the Rising of the Sun, meant many different things to Miłosz at the same time. And all of these meanings find their place in the poem and resonate with one another. First, that need was the result of the poet's relocation to a new continent whose culture and nature were in many ways different from the one he knew before. Secondly, his sense of loss was metaphysical, linked to the gap between Christian cosmology, which organized the social imaginary he had known from childhood, and the findings of modern science. But also this feeling of metaphysical loss was connected with this Gnostic conviction of being not from this world. Thirdly, and finally, Miłosz needed to reposition himself in the literary field in the face of a significant weakening of contact with his Polish-speaking readers and the milieu of Parisian culture, the cultura paryska. References to the Latin tradition, including the topos of Parnassus and the laurel wreath, helped give his text the potential canonicity within world literature, and did references to the modern alchemist, his cousin and precursor, in mediating mediating between the central and peripheral circuits of literature. That's all from me. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, if you have any questions about this last slide, I will just refer to it later on. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to listen to all three papers first, and then we'll do the discussion at the end. So thank you very much. That was a wonderful way to begin it. It gives us a lot to think about right from the very beginning. Our next speaker, Alexandra Narog, is a doctoral candidate at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She's currently working on a dissertation on affective dimensions in Witold Gombrowicz, and her main fields of interests are Polish modernist literature and the affective turn in the humanities. She will be speaking about Gombrowicz and Miłosz in a paper titled Miłosz and Gombrowicz, The Visions of Exile. Welcome, Alexandra.
Welcome. Thank you very much for your invitation again. I will share my screen in a moment. Do you see my presentation right now? All right.
Yes.
So once again, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to share with you today some result of my short research on a giant, large topic, which for sure is the relationship between Witold Gombrowicz and Czesław Miłosz. What I shall say first, the comparison between those two major Polish immigration writers is both obvious and complex for me and complicated, because their paths, the paths of their lives, intersected for their whole life. They polemized, corresponded with each other, were as well friends as well the opponents. They irritated each other, wrote letters to one another. Gombrowicz in his diary commented, for example, on the captive mind of Miłosz, while Miłosz, when he was very, very old, several years before his death, read The Possessed by Gombrowicz, and as Alexander wrote in one of his comments, he laughed very, very loudly reading Gombrowicz for all of his life. But what is the most important for me is the experience of exile, emigration, and the attempts to organize, to present their own identities in relation to Western culture, to Polonia, and the large topic of Polishness, the center and the peripheries. And the question of identity is very, very complex. And my thesis is that for Miłosz and Gombrowicz, it is a kind of cultural phantasm, the category of exile, and the vision, what I took from the visions from San Francisco Bay by Miłosz, for sure may be treated as a large category. Both Gombrowicz and Miłosz lived in France during different periods of their lives, and from different political and cultural situation, of course. As we know, Miłosz lived in America for about 40 years after the war, and later on in the 60s. Gombrowicz emigrated to Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1939, and later on, after 20 years, to Vannes in France in the 60s. And that is the photograph, a famous photograph of both of them when they met in Gombrowicz's house in France in 1966. They were both mature at this time. They were mature writers, but still feeling the constant fascination to each other, intellectual fascination. And what I would like to present now during those 20 minutes is not this whole complex relation, but the relationship between two texts that hadn't been compared before. I mean Miłosz's Visions from San Francisco Bay from 1969. The English translation by Richard Lurie, which is available right now in English, and Polish Memories and Wandering Around Argentina. I mean the second text by Witold Gombrowicz. The English translation of this book, Polish Memories, it was made by Bill Johnston. Unfortunately, the second part, shortest part, Wandering Around Argentina, wasn't translated to English right now. But I would like to make this comparison basing on my own translation of Gombrowicz's short feuilletons, short texts. What is important that both books show the popular visions of America or Americas, of both United States of Miłosz and Argentina by Gombrowicz, but they also ask different questions about existence, philosophy, and the perception of the other. On the other hand, what may be interesting for us from the today's point of view is the fact that both books may be treated as full of stereotypes and cliches, often misunderstatements of the perceived culture, or treating it in a dominative way. It is extremely interesting for me to try to read those two texts, Visions and the Memories, critically in the context of subjectivity thrown into the newly forming culture, or the problems for the Polish writer, Polish reader, who had to face with the place they haven't chosen. Those are the words of Miłosz. I have never chosen America. I was kind of thrown into it, as well as Gombrowicz has never. We can say he has never chosen in 100% Argentina. He just came to Buenos Aires before the rise of the Second World War in 1939, and he stayed. He didn't have another option in his life. So this is a constant situation of emigrancy, exile, of a specific state of subject. I am here. Those are first words of Miłosz's book, and I would like to focus on the topic of subjectivity built by Gombrowicz and Miłosz in their books. I am here means I am the subject. I am the subject who is like open book. Well, the relationship with other country is written. I am here, so here, right now, in that place, not at the other place, but I am. And what is the most important here, I think that both writers will, in different way, write more about their own subjectivity than about country they live in, they emigrated to, which we may suspect. So the first main difference that topic of comparison, maybe the titles of those two books, Visions of Miłosz and Wandering by Gombrowicz. As we may interpret, how can we interpret it? From my point of view, vision is a noun, is more statical. It is based on observation, and the work of the epiphany, secular epiphany, is a term of Richard Knysz from the book Literature as a trait of reality. So how the world shows itself to a subject who is a subject of this epiphany, but which is secular in a secularized world. So for Miłosz, the most important will be observation of not only of America, but on his own subjectivity in an essayist form. So this form can show the whole process of the creation of the subject, but of a more statical subject not being thrown into the world like Gombrowicz does in Wandering Around Argentina. Because wandering, those wędrówka, wędrować from the Gombrowicz texts is a more dynamical category. It's a verb. They will focus on exploration, the participation, and also the form. Gombrowicz describes his attitude towards Argentina, his memories from Argentina is different because it is a form of a colon. Those texts were found after Gombrowicz's death by Rita Gombrowicz in one of his archives, and they were exactly unpublished texts for Radio Free Europe program, which, as researchers say, cannot be found right now. We don't know if those texts were emitted on the radio. So this is the first main difference, which may show the whole attitude of Gombrowicz and Miłosz towards the topic of exile and emigration. Later on, the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity of the migrant, the whole question. I am here, as I quoted before, starts Miłosz. Visions from San Francisco Bay. Those three words contain all that can be said. You begin with those words and you return to them, from the essay My Intention. And they later on, the large quote beginning with the auto-analysis of his own body, of his own subjectivity, and again being thrown into a place he doesn't know, he needs to discover its phenomenon. So he again concentrates on himself. My hair, my chest, my hand, and my life with its date of such importance to me. The only question is whether they are really mine, whether the dates in my life do not lose importance as soon as they designate points in a general pattern. And this auto-analysis is also for Miłosz point of start to the analysis of popular American culture. He is being faced with, he criticizes, he something sometimes doesn't understand. I am beside by television, magazines, films, billboards with incitements to health and happiness, how I should wash, eat, and dress in an object of someone's concern. And it is myself I must see in the countless crotches advertising the slinkest of slips, in the breasts attired in the most alluring brass, in the musculature of shoulders wrapped with the finest oil. That is the thing that Miłosz pointed out also in the 40s. His critical reflection on American culture, which was without the experience of the war, the Second World War, present in Europe. He felt that how can we live, how the Europeans can live in America after the experience of the Second World War, how the culture, popular culture, may exist, how it forms my thought, my body. That's the main problem, but very subjectively treated. Gombrowicz goes in another way, also very subjective, but in a way of a column, of the more informal speech. He starts, to chat with you, my friends, about Poles in Argentina, but how? I suppose that you would be interested in how the Argentine sees and feels us. Yes, admit that it is more exciting for you as your embarrassing isolation continues and the malignant paradox of history condemns you to the role of a servant of Europe as at its very center. As we may see, first, a familiar treating of the reader, my friends, Gombrowicz writes, but in first words, we see the general Gombrowicz's attitude to the Polishness, a servant of Europe. Poland is a servant of Europe. The relation of power, building the vision of nationality, the complex, the isolation, the general process, and how the Argentine sees and feels us. So he creates his literature on seeing, feeling, on experiencing being a Pole, being an Argentinian, more dynamical than, in my opinion, Miłosz starts his text. The large similarity between those two writers is in a way of thinking and writing about the space of North and South America. I find something oppressive in the virginity of this country. Virgin in the sense it can be waiting for its names. The imagination of Miłosz and visions from San Francisco Bay is very, very spatial, basing on the pictures of explosion, the wind, sea lions, the wild nature. Similar as Gombrowicz does, he writes, America, clouds appear on the horizon, soon transforming into dark barriers. Vortices and currents begin to play in these masses covering the west. He also has to deal with boredom of the space of the land view. For example, he writes, "This horrible pampa, contact with nature doesn't pay off here. It's too poor and monotonous." So it is both for both writers a spatial experience, but also hard experience in comparison to the difference between the Polish landscape and the American landscape, which evokes a reflection about his own subjectivity and his own being in the world, the tremendous experience of being thrown into the world and the space. And another thing, the visions of the foreign culture, of American culture. Miłosz concentrates mainly on being himself, as he writes, being an incurable European. So the most important statement he makes in his text is that he's incurable European. His perspective will be always European and based on the comparison of the relationship between American culture and European culture. He also writes a lot about alienation, the ontological enemy of American being, which was for a constant time kind of empty to him, but he tried to understand it in a different way. Gombrowicz, on the other hand, writes about Polish culture as a thick culture, heterogeneous and rapid, but it's peasant culture. For him, Argentinian culture was described as imperialistic and bourgeois culture, based mainly on large cities like Buenos Aires and Mendoza, city culture contra peasant culture. But both, for Gombrowicz, what is crucial, both Polish and Argentinian culture were secondary cultures, but constantly copying its patterns from Western Europe. And he treated Argentinian culture as well as Polish culture when he wrote, "What loses Argentine culture is the desire to prove oneself to the world, to match it," as well as he wrote in his diaries about the Polish complex, the Polish thinking about the form, copying patterns from the West, thinking about each other in a way, in comparison to one another. So those were those main topics. And slowly going to finish, the most controversial thing for me, I would like to not to make clear statements about it, more ask questions about the topics from today's point of view about the racism and colonialism, which show in the worldview of both writers. What is important in Visions from San Francisco Bay in English translation, this text is not appearing. It appears in Polish edition of works of Czesław Miłosz. The title of this essay is The Black, which from some point of view may be treated as a very oppressive vision of the Black culture in 60s America. What Miłosz wrote here: hateful, you can't buy into Black's consideration if you have white skin. And I'm not going to try that. Of course, they should have equal rights and let them do whatever they want if they are further away from me. Their presence poisons me as it poisons the whole country because it is nothing but the unwilling of its foundation, which is called violence. It is a topic for another discussion, how to interpret this fragment, what Miłosz wanted to say in the whole context of the analysis of the situation of Black people in America, of protests. The statement of the subject, the subjectivity is important, that Gombrowicz, that Miłosz never goes straight forward into the society he's in. He's an observer looking at himself as a white and being not invited, not easy to join the community he is in. So this the America of Miłosz is in this text. I'm talking only about this text, is in this point of view something which is apart from him as a subject who needs to close himself to other experiences. Anyway, it is also Gombrowicz's scene when he describes the Argentinians. He uses the category of monstrosity in description of one of the men he meets in Mendoza. He looked at me and, waving his arms, shaking his head, he made more or less the following sounds. Matt, I guessed I went further, and on the next corner I asked another passerby about the same. He shook his eyes, grimaced, wrinkled, waved his arms and bent. I jumped off like a bird. Every country has its own monster. In Rosario, at every step you can see the representative monster of Argentina, namely a fat guy with a watch, a ring, slurping soup, picking a toothpick in his teeth, and delighted with himself. So Gombrowicz plays there with disgust for sure, but also from a point of view of a European, describing the Argentinian man. And as also I leave comments for this open, only with one comment of Slavoj Žižek, who writes that the monster like from monstrare, monstrare, the Latin form, shows to the subject deficiencies in his own existence, evokes metaphysical crisis. In my opinion, both Miłosz and Gombrowicz suffered from the large metaphysical crisis being thrown into the world. They need to show their nobleness, their thinking about it, their own as descendants of nobleman, but also about the Poles who need to confront with the other and how they deal with it. For me, this is still an open question, but I only wanted to signalize that problem. I know that we have to finish slowly finish right now, and then that my time is over. So just a short glimpse to the question of politics. To say it in several words, Miłosz in his text presents a large criticism of 60s counterculture. Gombrowicz writes also a lot on Argentinian politics, and this is interesting to see those two writers not only commenting the Polish culture, the Polishness, but the politics and the situation of the country they live in. And Gombrowicz writes on Argentinian politics as the field of passion, creating a discussion between hot Polish culture versus cold Argentinian culture. Those are his vision of being engaged or not being engaged with this main difference between Polish and European people. On the other hand, Miłosz writes about counterculture in America as a largely different thing between counterculture in Europe. I could speak a lot of more. Those are only my main ideas of how to deal with this large topic, just to compare pure words from this text and how to show problems they may focus on this hybrid identity with the reality of America's faced by those two writers. Thank you very much a lot. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Alexandra. Very interesting. And we will go right to our third paper by Dag Lindskog, or as we know him here, Sasha Lindskog, who is an assistant instructional professor of Polish here at the University of Chicago, where he teaches Polish language and culture. He's also a doctoral candidate at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and is writing his dissertation on Witkiewicz or Witkacz. His research interests include Polish, Ashkenazi, and transnational modernism, and theory of representation, subjectivity, and embodiment. And his paper today, the title is Negotiating Catastrophe, Czesław Miłosz and his use of Witkacz as an argument for realism.
Okay, hello, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, it works.
All right,
Hello.
great, okay. Okay, so using Witkacz as an argument for realism and phrasing that using space, I could call it using Witkacz as an argument for a second space, of tying back to the first paper that was presented. Okay, I will not have any slides, so I will just read my paper. Okay. The war years of 1940 to 44 saw Czesław Miłosz in Warsaw, engaging among other things in underground publication and writing two longer works of his own. One was his collection of poetry released after the war as Rescue, Ocalenie, and the other a collection of essays about modernity. Although finished in 44, this collection, Legends of Modernity, was not published until 96. It is a curious book, his first collection of essays, a sober assessment and settlement of accounts with modernity from the Enlightenment and onward, and especially a critical look at the events, philosophy, climate of the interwar years. On this final theme, the book finishes on the topic of catastrophism with a long essay on its godfather in Poland, by whom I mean Witkacz. The title of the essay is The Boundaries of Art, Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz from the Perspective of Wartime Changes. To this current, catastrophism, also Miłosz had been an adherent, and part of the argument of this paper is that Miłosz reframes his own catastrophist beginnings when writing about Witkacz. The latter was a representative of what can be called critical modernism in Poland, non-representational and nominalist, whereas Miłosz made philosophical realism and his use of a second space an integral part of his own argument. And so the second aim of my paper is to look at how Miłosz can use the theorist of pure form, Witkacz, as an argument for realism. Miłosz rehearses and assesses catastrophism soberly, yet clearly differentiates himself. Meanwhile, the poetry collection of the same period, Rescue, marks the beginning of a turn in Miłosz's poetry, a calmness and serenity, and arguably his realism. And so I will attempt to delineate this two-track dynamic of Miłosz's switch in Poetics and his reassessment and renegotiation of the catastrophist legacy, partly by means of Witkatzy. Let me begin by saying a few words about Catastrophism Rescue, Witkatzy, and the Witkatzy of Miłosz's essay. In the interwar years, Miłosz was part of the Vilnius-based group known as Żagaru, Brushwood, which was one of the central groups forming what has gone down in Polish literary history as the school of catastrophists. Being unconnected with the major avant-garde groups, not entirely connected, the poets hesitated between their sympathies for Marxism and their metaphysical frame of reference. That's a quote. But were held together by their dark vision in which the political was translated into the cosmic by means of a new kind of symbolism. This is from Miłosz's own History of Polish Literature. Miłosz's two collections of poetry from this time, A Poem on Frozen Time and Three Winters, are steeped in eschatological visions and sensual hunger. A short example from the poem Dawns. Not enough, one life is not enough. I'd like to live twice on this sad planet, in lonely cities and starved villages, to look at all evil, at the decay of bodies. Later, distancing himself from this worldview, he has said that of the period that, quote, the bitterness of dualism, the absolute, saved at this price, intoxicated me like the feel of a harsh surface after a smooth one that is impossible to grasp, end of quote. In Polska Literatura Nowoczesna, Michał Markowski distinguishes between two strands of Polish modernity, critical modernity and conservative modernity. What distinguishes them is the relationship they have toward representation or reality. Conservative modernity is the continuation of the mimetic tradition and assumes the existence of abstract entities independent of language. It is, in other words, representational and, in one word, realist. Critical modernity, on the other hand, has a trajectory passing Baudelaire and the Russian formalists and is the turn from representation to the medium itself. Hence, it is the representation of the crisis of realist poetics and is anti-realist and nominative. It assumes that, quote, language is not secondary to reality, but that it is party to its creation. Markowski notes that for realism, the same goes for the representation of reality, the world, or our own soul, citing some examples, Pan Tadeusz, but also Stanisław Przybyszewski's concept of the naked soul, as well as the lyrics of Czesław Miłosz. From the Second World War and onward, the theme of realism is central in Miłosz's writing. But in his early writing, unreleased alienation and longing for ecstasy are arguably the main themes. The establishment belief in the possibility of reality is under question here very much. If there was one, it may disappear. Miłosz has later argued that his early poetry follows a Manichaean logic, indicating a strong realist dualism, but this could be a later reassessment. For the purposes of this paper, I will not disentangle this question in terms of his early poetry, but note that the explicit argument of Miłosz's realism appears after his catastrophist years and in the face of actual catastrophe. In Witkatzy's case, these questions are seemingly less problematic. He repeatedly formulated the non-representationality of his art. For example, he writes in the foreword of his first novel, I have carefully avoided national and societal matters. My novel is without any backdrop, and so on. And more systematically in his treatises on pure form in painting and in theater. The question thus comes up, what does the poetically conservative Miłosz need the critical Witkatzy for, and how does he use him? At this point, let me go back to the boundaries of art, Miłosz's essay on Witkatzy in Legends of Modernity. The boundaries of art explicitly states that it is reviewing Witkatzy's oeuvre from the perspective of wartime changes. Miłosz does not evade Witkatzy's poetics, but cannily relates the author's formalism, its context and motivations. However, stylistically, he not only finds Witkatzy not pleasant, but also considers his novels monstrifications. Witkiewicz, quote, Witkiewicz attempted to load language to the maximum with meaning, giving the impression of verbosity, end of quote. Miłosz nevertheless acknowledges that the reason for this was not his, quote, intoxication with the music of style, but simply that the meaning he wished to express often loses its gravity for a later reader, end of quote. Although his poetics are conscientiously explained, this is not Miłosz's takeaway from Witkatze, and the Witkatze Miłosz is concerned with is not monstrous for the sake of style, but in fact for the sake of clarity of content, which, as Miłosz underlines, is also how we should concern ourselves with his writing, with its intellectual load. This load, in essence, being Witkatze's catastrophist historiosophy, and its variously formulated thesis on the disappearance of man's ability to have metaphysical experiences as a consequence of pragmatization and positivist instrumental thinking. That religion and philosophy no longer resonate with man on a metaphysical level, and that art will cease to do so shortly. Stressing these aspects, the Witkatze Miłosz fashions is a critic of modernity, not a modernist. He situates Catastrophe's discourse as a dispute beginning in an already pre-modern, what he calls lawsuit between poetry and reason, and takes note that the modern, and I quote, theory of pure art is like the bashful self-defense of poetry against an increasingly more powerful opponent. This took place through poetry's slow withdrawal from positions to which the other side made claims, just so long as she could retain something for herself in her modest circle, something that might remain untouchable. She borrows terminology of wise men and attempts with their help to erect a rampart around her minimal possessions. She succeeds only if she permits herself religious or metaphysical emotions, as did Poe, Baudelaire, Beaumont, and Witkiewicz. She does not succeed if those metaphysical emotions are to be rejected. Then the last scrap of ground slips away under poetry's feet, and she wakes up completely in the power of ethical speculative ideas. End of quote. Significant in this passage is that pure poetry is regarded as a self-defense against reason. In a type of symptomatic argument similar to Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, pure poetry is a defensive stance against co-optation by instrumental reason in the age of late modernity. On this point, Miłosz and Witkatze seem to agree, but the difference in their poetics has consequences. When Witkatze explains the reason for the need for artistic perversion, what he calls artistic perversion, he says, quote, creative artists can no longer communicate their experiences in the calm, straightforward forms of old, just as the viewers or listeners of today cannot be affected. End of quote. The symptom for modernity for Witkatze was man becoming automaton, and pure form was a form of resistance, the preservation of a space of metaphysical emotions. Miłosz was to take a different route and not consider man the symptom, but modernity, including modernist poetics. Catastrophe was not to be the end of history. Quote. This is from Miłosz's essay. Terrifying wars, exploitation and degradation, and also the idea of united humanity, workers' unions, insurance, universal education are all products of the same civilization. Is it necessary to strike at the foundations of this civilization in order to uproot everything that encumbers it? And he ends the essay answering simply, no. This no is so far but a proclamation of not giving up, and its consequences are not clear. What has come up, however, are two themes central to Miłosz's oeuvre: his polemic against pure poetry and the renegotiation of catastrophism in search for a new historiosophy. Like Legends of Modernity, Miłosz's wartime poetry collection, Rescue, takes a critical stance toward catastrophism. In A Song of the End of the World, this is taken on in a seemingly ironical tone. I'll quote from the poem. On the day the world ends, a bee circles a clover, a fisherman mends a glimmering net. Happy purposes jump in the sea. By the rain spout, young sparrows are playing, and the snake is gold-skinned as it should always be. Already in 1945, Jan Kott analyzed this as a recovery from the times of catastrophism, an ironic afterword to Three Winters, Miłosz's second poetry collection. While true, this is not the only new element added here. Less ironically, catastrophe here is somehow stopped being definite, stopped being the end of the world. In The Eternal Moment, Alexander Fjord argues that the poem contains the germ to Miłosz's later eschatology and historiosophy. Quote, "The end of the world occurs here without interruption, for it is always possible, always potentially present in the sacral dimension of human existence." End of quote. The end of the world here is thus not the end. It is something permanent and something permanently potential. This sacral dimension, or second space, was to become more and more important for Miłosz as his poetics develops. It is connected to his realism and sheds light on his historiosophy. But what exactly is its connection to them? As Miłosz bit by bit works out a new historiosophy, he will situate himself in a spiritual tradition that includes Gnosticism, the Orthodox concept of apokatastasis, William Blake, Emanuel Swedenborg, and Oskar Miłosz. What these metaphysics have in common is the axiom that reality is grounded in a beyond. In Gnosticism, the material realm is the work of the demiurge, and the divine reality is grounded somewhere else. The doctrine of apokatastasis teaches that what changes in fleeting time also has an external existence at the end of history. The conviction that all nature, including Satan, will be redeemed. In William Blake, whatever can be created can be annihilated, forms cannot. Emanuel Swedenborg authored the doctrine of correspondences between levels of existence. All these metaphysics have consequences for meaning and language. They are realist. They all state that abstract entities exist in another sphere, independent of our formulations. The second aspect of these doctrines is historiosophical. All of these metaphysics have a narrative of the fall. Gnosticism assumes the material world to be the result of a cosmic catastrophe. William Blake delineated a dystopia where one of the aspects of the world, reason, had become hegemonic. Emanuel Swedenborg assumed that the Last Judgment took place in 1757, but on a parallel plane of existence. Before his death in the summer of 1939, Oskar Miłosz predicted the apocalypse to happen in 1944. Reestablishing his historiosophy in this trajectory of Lapsarian realists, Miłosz can displace imminent catastrophe into a constant catastrophe somewhere else, and speak of catastrophe in the lower case and in the plural. This begs a question. What happens to catastrophism in the face of actual catastrophe? I'll quote the first line of the Miłosz poem again. "On the day the world ends, a bee circles a clover, a fisherman mends a glimmering net." On the one hand, there is the consideration that I was right, catastrophe did occur. On the other, there is the realization that the catastrophe means nothing, that the world will go on. Read this way, actual catastrophe is, one could say, a trauma to catastrophist discourse. The imminent seems to retain no discursive relevance and relieves the catastrophist of his Cassandra complex by way of shattering his discourse. Miłosz negotiates this breach by relieving himself of some of his historiosophy through the process of differentiating himself from Witkatsu, and negotiates a new one in his realist poetics. Miłosz's second essay on Witkatsu appeared in The Captive Mind in 1953. Having defected from a high diplomatic position in the Polish People's Republic 2 years earlier, this is another settlement of accounts, this time with communism. Miłosz frames the larger psychopolitical essay with an account of the Myrtibing pill from Witkatsu's novel Insatiability. In the novel, the pill is a drug by which the Chinese spread communism. Not being able to deal with the gradual internal split that communism entails, it extinguishes its subjects' inner resistance and makes him a complacent citizen. For Witkatsu, this is no doubt connected with his historiosophy of man's automation. When Miłosz appropriates it, he uses it to explain how an intellectual deals with what he calls the schizophrenia required of him in communism. At first, he goes through a crisis between an angel and a demon, not knowing which is which. I'll quote, "One has a bright face known since childhood. This must be the angel. No, for this face bears hideous scars. It is the face of the old order, of stupid college fraternities, of the senile imbeciles of politicians, of the decrepitude of Western Europe. This is death and decadence. The other face is strong and self-contained, the face of a tomorrow that beckons. Angelic, that is doubtful." End of quote. Let us also parenthetically note that the return of the appropriation of decadent and catastrophist discourse, that this is a return of the appropriation of decadent and catastrophist discourse in the communist discourse, or apropos of the communist discourse, before looking at how the split is reconciled. Quote, despite his resistance and despair, the crisis approaches. It can come in the middle of the night, at his breakfast table, or on the street. It comes with a metallic click as of engaged gears. But there is no other way, that much is clear. There's no other salvation on the face of the earth. The revelation lasts a second, but from that second on, the patient begins to recover. For the first time in a long while, he eats with relish. His movements take on vigor, his color returns. He sits down and writes a so-called positive article, marveling at the ease with which he writes it. In the last analysis, there was no reason for raising such a fuss. Everything is in order. He's past the so-called crisis. So what is relinquished here? Doubt, the possibility to criticize? By positing this in the context of Wittkatz's and decadence, the question of the state of the intellectual under communism is situated in the larger context of catastrophism and modernity. In his final essay dedicated to Wittkatz's, written for an Anglophone audience in the 60s, Miłosz sees Murty Bingists in the American 60s drug culture search for oneness. Automation, schizophrenia, and medication indeed appear to be the modern condition for Miłosz. If the artistic answer for this is not modernist poetic, but perspective in the form of realism. Okay, as Marta Skvara notes, Miłosz returned to Wittkatz's for his for what she calls his moral absolutism, as somebody who had stated a problem that as the century progressed needed to be reinterpreted, and found in the late writer a framework for the problems he saw both in the Sovietization of life as well as the utopian escapism of the American 1960s. What this paper adds to this interpretation is the formal consequences this has. Miłosz has to put aside Wittkatz's formal modernist endeavors and look only at his intellectual load. Miłosz differs from Wittkatz's because he does not in the end see man becoming automaton as the symptom of modernity, and not Wittkatz's catastrophism per se either, but in fact, what we could call Wittkatz's formalism or his nominalism. Being thus intertwined, however, Miłosz needs to separate the catastrophism from the writer's poetics and situates it in a realist historiography and poetics as well. Nominalist catastrophism is an atypical discourse because it places its aporia in the future, thus always heading toward its own foreclosure. By positing realism, Miłosz seems to open up for the possibility of an eventual telos for catastrophism. Traumatized by catastrophe, Miłosz wants catastrophism to be redeemed by a sacral dimension. In the land of Ulru, as in many other places, this redemptive process takes the form of Ignatius of Loyola walking through history. You should, Loyola advises, I quote, you should, Loyola advises the adept, continually return in thought to the time when Jesus was teaching in Galilee, to the towns and roads of the region, and put yourself among his listeners. Accompany him on his earthly wanderings, be present at his death. Loyola, in effect, advises the reader to swim upstream through the ages of civilization, through succeeding generations, through whole lifespans from old age to birth, surveying in reverse the multitudinous procession of human lives that make out what we call history. All right, thank you.
I know, I met him last night.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and all three of you. Really interesting, wonderful papers. So I am not a discussant. I'm really just chairing the panel, but in the spirit of helping things get off, helping spark the discussion, I will maybe pose a first question here, try to formulate it, and I'm trying to draw the papers together. I might work backwards in doing so. So, Sasha, you were just referring to the sacral dimension and the place of that in some sort of teleology, and I'm thinking through that in relation to this problem of exile that Alexandra was discussing, and this initial perception of that as some sort of barren space where the poet is separated from the historical process. And I think Miłosz trying to orient himself in California, in part in some ways because he didn't know the culture. That essay on the Black is really interesting. I did not know about that. But that sense of I'm not going to try to engage. Of course, that is a complex problem that he's discussing. But I just wonder if it might relate in some ways to a sense of how he fit initially when he arrived in the West, and particularly in California. So was California a kind of second space for him, and in this kind of ahistorical space for him, and this also I think I want to bring in maybe the potential to talk about this pristine landscape that he found himself in. I think that I was trying to connect back to both. I mean, with Karina, you were talking about this kind of paratopic position, being outside. And maybe that's an angle for you to jump in here as well. I'll start with that. I have kind of a follow-up, but I don't want to make my question so long that it has too many dimensions. So any of you can respond.
I may start.
Sure, Karina, please.
Thank you both, my other panelists, for your speeches. It was very interesting to hear you, and really connecting all our pieces, all the pieces that we throw on the table is a bit of a challenge, yet an interesting one. I actually would like to ask Sasha about, if I understood well, your thesis about if I will try to paraphrase your thesis, and you will just tell me if I'm right. So to answer this question, if what for Miłosz used Witkacy, you kind of said that he tried to make him a kind of ally by actually misinterpreting his poetics and his views on the modernism and catastrophe and so on, to kind of, and I will just use my own language here, legitimize this redemptive energy, I don't know, that he invested in talking about the catastrophe and this idea of apokatastasis. I'm trying to connect what you've said with my own piece, actually, because I think that this exactly same reason, actually, that Miłosz needed Oskar Miłosz for, is to also legitimize his kind of eschatological way of like looking at himself, at the world, and maybe also at literature as this, as you called it, I just noted it somewhere. No, I didn't note it. Like metaphysical realism, I don't know. Like this is, as you said, this is still realism, yet it's the abstract metaphysical phenomena as like real, right? So it's the kind of realism that it's there's a tension between this kind of thinking and modernism, maybe, and to ease this tension, to legitimize his way of thinking, he used several actually actors of the literary field, I guess. Okay, thank you.
I absolutely agree with everything you said, I would say. I mean, I think that he uses Witkatsu as an example. We could talk about how he uses Brzozowski as a way to distance himself from his own earlier Marxism as well, which is more his very first collection of poetry, interestingly, that was more rarely reprinted as well. But yes, but for Witkatsu, he uses parts of him to legitimize himself and place himself and sort of take on the parts he likes about his own early writings. This is my interpretation, but also as a foil to distance himself from those parts of his early writings he does not like. I hope that's an answer to your question, Karina. I'll also answer something that William said, or that Bill said, which is to say, it's interesting also that, I mean, I think that the obvious context for Miłosz's wartime writing is the war. That's the obvious context. But in this context, one may also add that this is when he moves, right, from what today is Lithuania, and also moves to Warsaw. So it's his first permanent first resettlement. Of course, he's traveled, but that's the first time he moves from that space. So that's another context when he moves to Warsaw in 1914.
Alexandra.
Oh, sorry. I just want
Go ahead, Karina.
To just add something that I haven't got enough time to say, that I think that using Oskar Miłosz in my case, but also with Witkatsu, if you think about the captive mind, Miłosz is actually very fortunate. I mean, there is this word fortunny in Polish. I'm not sure how to translate it. Agent, I don't know, he succeeds. I mean, like he's, for example, and I wanted to show you also the part of his Nobel speech, when he also
disturbed the vibe. I mean, challenging. I did.
Karina, I think you, I think we lost the connection maybe.
Yeah. Well, while we're waiting, well, let's leave Karina a minute to reconnect. Hopefully, I just want to encourage audience members to submit questions. Well, maybe she, yeah, Aleksandra. Esther, can you allow Aleksandra to enter? Or do we need to, there she is.
Hello, yes, so I have one question to Karina. I hope she will return, and also one question to Sasha. Could you speak a little bit, because when talking about realism, we were mostly thinking about realism in this philosophical sense of being opposed to nominalism. And did you think about it also in terms of, literary kind of a style or movement, and how does it play with, the ideas, the ways in which Miłosz was writing his poetry? Can we have realist poetry in this sense? Is there any link between this big thinking about realism as opposed to nominalism, and using realism, especially when you're a poet and not a prose writer? Like, is there anything to be said about the two, or do you treat this word as something totally separate from these discussions? I'm thinking about this because, of course, as you know, it already started during the war, but also after the war, there were these big discussions about realism, especially in Polish prose, but to some extent also in Polish poetry, that finally, led to socialist realism in the very late 40s. But earlier, these were discussions about realism. So is there any place for Miłosz in these discussions? Or is it a very different kind of realism you're thinking about? So if you have any thoughts, it would be great to hear them. And I also have a question for Karina. So again, just to kind of clarify, if I understand you correctly, if we agree. So I was thinking about this moment when you talked about Lauda in his poem. And in a sense, I agree with you that in a sense, he brings Lauda into discussion, into conversation with all of these mythical big spaces we know from, say, European culture. There's like Patmos and other well-known places. But I wonder, does it really make Lauda like equal to these places? Or is it just this gesture in which we have these model mythical spaces and we are just trying to make this small local area kind of mythicized, kind of raised above something concrete into something much more kind of idealized? Isn't there still this kind of hierarchical structure in which we have these points of reference and we are just trying to move Lauda into this area? Or would you say that it's treated as equal to all of these other places which appear in this poem? Okay, thank you.
I think it's thank you for the question. It's a very good question. It's a complex question, and I'm wondering if I will be able to think it through it at this moment. I think that there, right. So the question here, when we talk about the general term of realism, it depends, of course, but what kind of reality? What is the philosophical basis of that idea of reality, which is where we get the question of universals and its two main strands of thinking of realism and nominalism. But yeah, I'm trying to think it through it, how that connects to the arguably one could ask. I do think that there is connection between philosophical realism and poetical realism, or the poetics of realism, the school of literature, but it's not the same. In terms of socialist realism, arguably, it's not very realist at all from the philosophical standpoint. It has to paint reality precisely. Has to paint reality that it is actually very nominalist, and one could argue, I suppose, that perhaps that is why it is so. One of the reasons why it is so antithetical to Miłosz's point of view. That's my spontaneous thought on your question.
I also thank you for the question. I'm sorry to be absent for a while. I'll just go back to what I was saying, because I think it's connected with what you asked about. So I was trying to say that I find Miłosz's efforts to legitimize his worldview and so on and so forth as effective. And the proof for that is, for example, the fact that he got a Nobel Prize, and during his Nobel Prize speech, he talked extensively about Oskar Miłosz and how much he is endowed with him. And I read this Nobel speech as the way of saying that he is endowed with Oskar Miłosz, but not as a person, but as a figure that he used, in his writings. And I also think about this Lauda as a space that he succeeded to create as his own Parnassus. And in this way, I think it, of course, could be interpreted differently, yet for me, it is a success of adding another mythical space to those that existed, that are from another language, another mythology, actually, and becomes a part of this global mythology as peripheral as it is, right? That's how I want to think about it.
As a follow-up to Alexandra's question, I was just thinking that Miłosz arrives in California at Berkeley and begins teaching literary history and writes, a history of Polish literature, and so maybe these frameworks also thinking of some sort of cultural teleology within that framework maybe played a part in kind of thinking through his own past.
Yeah, one may say that he attached some kind of redemptive power to those Polish post-war poetry that he translated soon after he came to the US, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That I'm referring now to the importance of Second World War that Sasha was underlining.
But other questions from the audience, our guests? Karina, you were also cut off when you were disconnected. Did you get to finish what you were trying to say?
I did with this comment on the Miłosz Nobel Prize speech. Yet I may just, if we have some time, go back to my last slide from this last poetic book by Miłosz, Second Space, right? You are seeing it now, right? So there is this theological treatise published there, very interesting text, of course, one of 3 treatises that Miłosz wrote, and that I like to read also with this Mongenau theory to see how he tries to establish some ethical rules to the community that he addresses those texts. So this is an interesting situation here with this theological treatise when he stages this negotiations between theology and literature, actually, I think that he tries to also, by staging this negotiations of what discourse have more power, right, theology or literature, he gains some advantage as a writer, and succeeds to make the literature this the proper theology of the modern times. And there is this phrase, the meaning is impossible without an absolute point of reference. So that's also something that can be connected with the Oskar Miłosz's cosmology, right? This need to situate himself by the man is somewhere in the middle of this discourse. But I just still need to think about it a little more to say it properly. That's just something I find interesting. That, the thing that how important this subject was for him and how it haunted him for the whole of his life. Okay, thank you.
We have a question from Robert Haas. How to connect the notion of literary realism and its metonymies to the notion of place. is one question. We also, there's a second question from Karina Jarzyńska wants to ask Aleksandra if she thinks that the kind of competition between Miłosz and Gombrowicz was good for Polish literature. So I'll put those two questions out.
Okay, I can say something briefly. I think it's a very complex question, but it seems to me that, as I mentioned, that this becomes shaped more and more to the extent that Miłosz starts moving. So in a way, he needs the metaphysical anchor, as it were, in another space to the extent that he is further away from somewhere. And there is a way in which his concreteness of the place might be facilitated by his anchoring in a second space. And that's my short answer to that.
I might have one just kind of follow up just to Karina, just thinking about the Lauda River as that kind of anchoring, perhaps, that, and was this something that becomes important for him, when he's so far from that space, right? That he's kind of thinking about his own history or place in history, but these kind of anchor points. He writes so much about the importance of Vilno and all of these places that he's been in his past. So is there something, as you read this, or Lauda, does it feel like it's coming from a kind of far away, a beautiful far away, to quote a passage from a Russian tradition? Well, Aleksandra, did you want to respond to the question about Miłosz and Gombrowicz?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. The main point is, in my opinion, that the literary strategy of Gombrowicz was the strategy of duel, of the competition, of competing with each other. And what is more, it is interesting what you have said previously. The strategy of Miłosz also may be having a figure of Brzozowski, Oskar Miłosz of Gombrowicz, a figure in which he can see his own pose, his own identity, and also in a relationship to the other construct his own identity. And the question is, was it good for the Polish literature? I don't think I can judge this, but for sure it was productive for the various interpretations. It was it is still the correspondence between Miłosz and Gombrowicz is alive, and is a picture of a live thought between those two writers, as well as the, for example, duel between Gombrowicz and Schulz. This is the question of the visions of Polish and of Polish modernity, of thinking about modern literature, the constant thought in progress. So from my point of view, for sure, but we shouldn't forget it is often a form both writers like to play on with, not the real conflict, but having a mask of an adversary showing up, using a convention, various ideas about it. So, but I'm still thinking also about this question. Thank you.
Okay, well, with that, we are at time, and I want to thank all three of our panelists. The really interesting papers that intersected in fascinating ways, and I'm sure we will be thinking about them throughout the day and probably coming back to some of the themes and questions they raised. So let's give them a round of applause, and we will meet again. We'll reconvene at 12:30 for our roundtable, so everyone in Chicago can get a little lunch break, and those in Poland can eat some dinner perhaps, and we'll all come back reinforced. So we will see you all soon. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.